Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and a very warm welcome. It's my great pleasure first to introduce our President, Her Royal Highness Princess Laurentine, who's an extremely hard-working president. She goes all over the world for FFI. She's the most fantastic advocate for us. We're extremely proud to have her as our president, and she's going to introduce our speakers.
Well, first of all, I don't work nearly as hard as these two individuals. I'm really delighted that you've turned up in so many tonight, and no wonder that you've turned up. I'm sure that there's a queue outside still. And I'm delighted to just take a few minutes to set the scene for tonight. We'll be sitting back for an hour and a half with the great joy of a conversation between the two of you, guided by who I would call two esteemed and beloved individuals, be it in their own ways, esteemed and beloved. Of course, Sir David Attenborough, who I've had the pleasure of introducing twice, the second time now. The first time you gave me a slap on the wrist, or I gave you a slap on the wrist, I can't remember. And our esteemed and beloved director, Mark Rose, who has been for so many years at FFI, and it's certainly one of the reasons, apart from the excellent staff, that I have been engaged with FFI for a number of years. So what is this hour and a half going to be? It's a journey, the way I would see it, around the world. It's 60 years back, it's the now, and it is the future. I'm sure we're going to hear, or if I'm sure now, I'm sure it's going to be completely different. Astute observations, because you've both been to so many places and seen so many species. Insights into the great challenges of conservation, but also some of the successes, I hope, we're going to talk about. And I'm sure there's going to be lots of personal anecdotes of memorable moments, including the very moment, and I'm sure you all have had that an idea was born. And then many years later, everybody always thinks that the idea has always been there. Those are the best ideas. But there was that one moment when there was a phone call, when there was a conversation, that an idea was born. And I believe in the great importance of knowing what the source of an idea is, because then you know where you're going. So it's a unique conversation that up until 3 weeks ago was completely different. Up until 3 weeks ago, Sir David was going to be interviewed by Mark. And then they had a chat without 700 people present. So Sir David had free rein of what to do with the conversation. And Sir David said, no, I've been doing that for so many years. I'm going to turn it upside down, and I'm going to interview Mark. I won't tell you about the initial reaction of Mark, but there's no turning back. So I feel, and I'm sure that you feel the same, very privileged to be party to this dialogue on stage, which started as a fireside chat, which I'm sure is a continuation, and just pretend that the fire is burning behind you. You're two remarkable people. There are many remarkable and heroic people around the world, with no spotlights on them, working locally. We work with them locally, and it's absolutely tremendous. And so tonight, with two remarkable people on stage, let's also remember the many remarkable people around the world who make conservation possible. And being remarkable is not about who you are. It's about what you do. And when the world is on fire, we as individuals, each and every one of us, individually and together, we have a duty. And we have a duty to make the best of it. And to put our talents, to put our titles, to put our resources to good use. Otherwise, titles, resources, talents mean very little if we don't do something with it. So with that said, more urgent than ever, we need to do that. There are 700 people here. We each and every one have a duty to make sure that tonight or in the next year, we reach at least 100 people, each and every one of us. because without that, it won't go the right way. But with that said, let's go back to your fireside chat. It's wonderful that you could join us and spend so much time. We are proud to have you as our Vice President, Mark and Sir David.
Thank you. Now, I actually had a very good reason for suggesting that what should happen this evening was that I should interview Mark, because Mark has been engaged in writing the history of this wonderful institution. It is a wonderful institution. As far as I know, it's certainly in this country, it's the first conservation institution that was concerned with natural history beyond our shores. Whether it was the very first in the world, I don't know, but it certainly was the first in this country. I thought that with all the research that Mark has been doing for this new book, that he would be in a position to keep us on the straight and narrow and telling us about how this remarkable institution was founded and how it progressed. I'll tell him how I first knew of it. I was a zoology student in Cambridge in the 45. And there was only one conservation journal, only one conservation journal in this country. And that was Oryx, which was explaining what happened about and how we should conserve animals. It was a pioneer. I dare say it was regarded as being slightly cranky back in 1945, because the problems of conservation were not well understood. So they published Oryx, and that dealt with conservation in a scientific way. And I joined the charity because I wanted to take the journal and to discover what serious people were thinking about and how they were progressing conservation. So, Mark, how did this institution strike you as an outsider at that time?
Well, in a very similar way, I was actually also studying zoology, but at Royal Holloway College. And I noticed Oryx, because it still does have tremendous front covers. And I saw this in amongst all the other journals, which were actually looking rather dull and boring. And I thought, okay, that's the one for me. And when I got into it, I loved the whole briefly section that you could read. And it was like an update of what was going on in conservation around the world. And so I got engaged in that. And then later on, my tutor, Dr. Pat Morris, who's also responsible for having me in Holloway in the first place, and was also on the board as a trustee of FPS, as it was then, or FFPS, I think, at that time. And Pat introduced me to John Burton, who was then the General Secretary at the time. And eventually I ended up working in a tiny little office in Soho with Viv Burton, Sue Wells and Tim Inskip on looking at trade in endangered species. And that was the birth of what we know today as traffic. It came about from that little Soho office, which was no bigger than this stage, piled up with documentation and a few old apricot computers at that time. And so that was my journey into FFI at that time. Then I went away and came back later. But that was my first impression of FFI, and it was one of a small organization punching above its weight, producing a very, very good journal with a lot of really interesting and respected people involved with it.
Well, some of them, and we might as well explain at this point, some of them, and we're talking about the 1950s, 40s, 50s, some of them had looked back to when the charity was founded, which was when?
The charity was founded in 1903, and it is the oldest international conservation organization in the world.
Yeah.
And it's actually Tim who's writing the book, by the way. I just conceived it, and I've been doing a lot of design working with Tim. But the book, which is called With Honourable Intent, and will be published by HarperCollins next year, plug, deals with the society over the period from 1903 to the current day, It builds on the books that Richard Fitter wrote about the penitent butchers, and also the Against Extinction, which Professor Bill Adams wrote at Cambridge University. So we're building on that. It's a sort of story from start to the end, and it's a story about people, because conservation is about people. And it looks very much at the way those people worked at the time. It looked at what they did. And if we look at the founders of this organisation, we're talking about people like Edward North Buxton, Samuel Whitbread, the Duke of Bedford. We're talking Lord Salisbury, Lord Kitchener, and also Teddy Roosevelt. And it was a very smart move. They were worried about the end of the game. But it was with honourable intention. That's why, as per the title. And they basically got together and put together a society called the Society for the Protection of the Wild Fauna of the Empire.
Of the British Empire.
Of the Empire. Not a very snappy title, I have to say, but the strapline was good, live and let live. For a bunch of hunters, you know.
But the other truth, Mark, is that actually a very significant element within the society came from people who were big game hunters. Mm-hmm. And whatever you think about big game hunting in the 19th and early 20th century, they knew about animals. Mm-hmm. They loved animals. And it sounds bizarre, I know, but they nonetheless did. They really understood about animals. And they were the first people to notice that actually, because every big game hunter went after for the biggest, the one with the individual with the biggest horns, that they were becoming smaller, that the big mature animals were becoming rarer. That was what concerned them. And you may say, oh, well, they were just worried about they weren't going to get the trophies they used to. But it wasn't just that. They were beginning to understand, and they were the first people to do so, that actually the world, the natural world, was under pressure from human beings, and they were going to do something about it. And they had a nickname. They were called the Penitent Butchers. And it was an appropriate nickname.
Yeah. And they were very, I mean, if you read their meetings, the meeting notes, which are actually, you can tell there was a bottle of sherry at these meetings, because they were very finely written at the start, and by the end of it, you know, the notes were going down like this. But those meetings, they mentioned education, they mentioned trade in endangered species, they looked at marine conservation at that time. They were very advanced in their thinking about all these issues. But what even further, they were smart and clever and politically astute and well-connected. So what they were doing was basically lobbying, moving around bits of paper in Whitehall in order that all the protected areas that we know today, or nearly all of them, in sort of Africa, which were created at that time, were created by the society. And I had a déjà vu moment last week. I was actually sitting in Somerset House, which used to be the old Admiralty building, and I was chairing the board meeting of a conservation organisation called Blue Marine, which was set up by Charles Clover, George Duffield, and Chris Gorrell-Barnes, after the book and the film of The End of the Line. And it's all about overfishing and setting up more marine protected areas. And there we were with Lord Deben, who used to be the Under-Secretary of State for the Environment, and a few other politos at the time, trying to get a consensus around the table on how we could make a huge marine area around Ascension Island. And that's where Charles is today, in Ascension, trying to negotiate that further. So Blue Marine is an organisation which we helped generate. It was founded by those three people, but we supported it in its early stages. We still do. And there again, history is repeating itself. We're going to have some big marine protected areas in the UK dependencies as a result.
Let me take you back, nonetheless, to right at the beginning. So these penitent butchers, one of the things that they were very concerned about, and the reason that there is this on our ties and as the emblem of our emblem, is that they were concerned about oryx. The Arabian oryx was on the verge of extinction. How close was it, and what did they do about it?
Well, there was a young Californian biologist called Lee Tolbert, who was a vice president of ours. He's still very close to the society. And he was commissioned by IUCN to do a report on endangered species. And he found that the oryx was on the verge of extinction. So the Society commissioned him to find a way forward. He went to Kenya. He hired Major Ian Grimwood at that time, found him in his big castle there. And Major Ian Grimwood, who was a game warden in Kenya, agreed that he would take an expedition out to capture the last oryx and bring them back out of the wild. At that time, he'd just heard that 28 had been slaughtered by Qatari hunters, who were the main tribe or country hunting at that time in that area. But so people thought it might be too late, but it wasn't. But it was not such a success as everybody hoped. Only after a month's searching, they found only 3 oryx, and they transported those back with the help of the RAF to Isiolo in Kenya, where they were held in a station, and then on to Phoenix Zoo, which had agreed to take them and set up the stud book and the wild herd. Now, although it wasn't a success, having only 3 oryx, what then happened, the other zoos said, well, we'll pool our resources and we'll bring ours into Phoenix as well. And at the same time, a number of collectors in the Middle East, particularly in Saudi Arabia, put their hands up and said, well, I've got 10, I've got 13, I've got 14. And you can imagine how Grimwood felt, having broken 3 ribs, spent a month on hard tack, having to get the RAF involved in going out to get these 3 oryx. He suddenly finds out that these oryx are everywhere in the Middle East, but they happen to be in captive. So they eventually got about 65 animals together, started breeding them, and by the 1980s, there were 300 animals bred up, and then they released them, first of all, into Shomari in Jordan, where the King Hussein guaranteed their protection, which was a captive enclosure, but then into Oman, where the Sultanate said that they would guarantee their protection, particularly under the guise of Ralph Daly, OBE, one of our vice presidents, but also the Harissa tribe, who greatly revered the oryx and actually said that they would take responsibility for looking after it. And that still continues to this day.
So that's a remarkable achievement for our society, is it not? It initiated the concept of taking animals that were on great danger of total extinction, of taking it into captivity and breeding it up with proper respect for stud books and so on, and reintroducing to the wild. So you are the supporters of the society, we can feel that is a feather to put in our cap.
And it was a first.
Yes.
It was a first.
My point.
Yep.
My point. And so what else in the desert area? Are we still as vigorous as ever?
Yeah, we're working in the drylands of northern Kenya and also in the desert in Mongolia. In Mongolia, we're working on a very large mining operation there with a mining organization. And we've been working there for 5 years because, as a lot of you know, FFI works with corporations. It tries to mainstream biodiversity considerations within corporate plans. And we started off doing that about 17 years ago with some success, and our first success was with BP. And I can always remember going into John Brown's office, and he said, look, I'll give you half an hour, and you can tell me why, how, and how much. And I could put together the why and the how. And bearing in mind then the business case for biodiversity wasn't well constructed, or we didn't have a lot of experience, but I never told him how much. We're still working on that one. But anyway, we actually mainstream biodiversity throughout BP. We haven't been successful with all the companies we're working with, and one in particular, which is working in Oy Tolgai in Mongolia, has now, because of the downturn in the value of minerals, they've started to pull out of all their environmental considerations. And that's something that we're very mindful of at the moment, that because of this downturn in natural commodity prices, we're seeing companies who otherwise committed to no net loss and good environmental performance are now letting that slip. So that's just one thing I'd like to point out. But the other thing is that we're working in northern Kenya, where we've worked for very many years, and about 10 years ago, a person who may be familiar to a lot of you called Ian Craig approached me and said, look, Mark, we really must do something about this northern area of Kenya. For a long time, there's been a lot of conflict between the Rendili and the Boran tribes, and also the Samburu. And we see a chink of light. Would FFI be able to help in putting a project together which gives these local communities the conservation wherewithal to manage their own resources? So I went with Ian, and a friend lent us a helicopter, and we flew around, and it was interesting. We saw these Rendili and these Boran tribes, and they're all carrying AK-47s and looking very fierce. And when we land, the AK-47s have all gone, and it's the bow and arrows and the traditional garb, you know. All the AKs have been stuck under a rock somewhere. And we had some productive discussions. It was maybe 12 years ago now. And on our way back, we stopped at a place which we felt was an ideal place for a conservancy. And we thought we also might find an old male lion there, which we'd been looking for. Anyway, we broke out not the hardtack, but the beers and the sandwiches. And all of a sudden we heard this noise. And we couldn't quite make out where it was coming from. And we tracked around, and suddenly what we found was a well. And down the well was this baby elephant. And obviously it had fallen down the well, and the herd had got fed up waiting for it, so it was there. So we got some ropes, and we pulled the elephant out. It was dehydrated, it was sunburnt, and what we decided to do was we'd put it in the helicopter, and we'd find the herd, and we'd drop it off, give it a lift. So, easier said than done.
Certainly.
We get in the helicopter. I'm not driving the helicopter, obviously. I'm in the back seat with the elephant. Problem is, only one back seat, elephant on top. This is a 6-month-old elephant. Okay. So we fly around, we find the herd. And we fly in, the herd scatters a bit, we back off, and then we let the elephant out the door. And the baby elephant just shoots straight off towards the big matriarch. And the matriarch just slaps it down. Yeah. And so, and the herd moves off, and the young elephant does it again, and slap down again. And we thought, well, either two things have happened here. One, that this is the wrong herd, or they've decided because of us that they don't want the youngster back. So we tried for about 2 hours, and in the end, we decided we'd have to scatter the herd because the young elephant was getting more and more distressed. And so we basically moved in, opened the doors of the helicopter, and the elephant came towards us, the young elephant. So we got it in the back on my lap, and I said, oh, how far is it to where we're going? And we were going to an elephant sanctuary in Nairobi. They said, oh, about an hour. I'm thinking, anyway. So we're going for about 20 minutes, and the elephant's getting more and more fidgety. And it's obviously, it's got heat exhaustion and everything else, so it's not very, very good. But it manages to be able to open the handle of the door. So I've got visions of, Kikuyus all sitting around having their dinner, and suddenly an elephant dropping through the roof, So, and I'm having trouble holding this elephant in, so that I got from the pilot, I said, give me your shirt. So I took his shirt, put it over the elephant's head, poured some water over it, and it settled it down. And to cut a long story short, we flew into Daphne Sheldrick's orphanage in Nairobi, and I was asleep, the elephant was asleep, exhausted, I was exhausted, and the elephant was brought up successfully and now is in the Masai Mara, heading up its own herd. So, nice story. The more serious side of that is that led to what we now know is the Northern Rangelands Trust, and that spans over 5 million acres of that desolate area, putting together 15 different conservation projects And I'm looking at Claudio Segre here in the front row because Claudio is one of the people who has made this happen over the years by supporting it. So thank you, Claudio. And so we've got 15 communities now managing their own resources. We put in Matt Rice as the COO to head it all up, and it's growing and growing and growing, and it's becoming more and more successful.
So you see, the Secretary of your society is not a paper conservationist. He's someone who knows about the nitty-gritty. Now, let me go back a step now. Let me take you back to the work that the Society does in tropical rainforests. In 1979, I was starting on a big television series called Life on Earth. And we decided, actually against my better judgment, the producer concerned, I had written a program about apes and explaining how, in fact, the opposition of the thumb and forefinger, which apes had developed in order to grip on branches, how this was a key thing in human evolution, because it enabled, if you could do that, you could hold a tool. And if you could hold a tool, you could move into a completely different world. And so I wanted to do that, and I thought I'd do it with chimps. And the producer said, not at all. There's a woman in the Congo, in the central Congo, who's been working with gorillas, and she has habituated them. We can do it with her. And I said, you're mad. Diane Fossey is a famous character at the time, and a very, very vigorous and rather alarming woman, to be truthful. I said, she'll never agree. And John said, well, we'll write to her. So he wrote, and much to my surprise, we got a letter back saying, yes, she would see us, and she would introduce us to her gorillas. So John and I and the camera crew and sound crew, we flew out to Rwanda. And we were met by Ian Redmond, who was a young zoologist working with Diane at the time, with very, very black news. Digit, who was the first gorilla that Diane had befriended, had just been shot by poachers. And Diane was distraught. The fact was that Digit was a young male, and the fact that they had a bond, an extraordinary bond, and Diane was bereaved. And so we had to walk up to Cariso, to the camp, which is high up on the volcanoes. And Diane was indeed distraught. She was in bed. She had a mad medical history. She was spitting blood, and she didn't know what to do about Digit. But she pulled herself together to the extent that the following day, in spite of being so ill, she took us out and introduced us to the gorillas. Now, when I say introduced us, I wasn't aware that he had introduced us. What had happened was that we followed her, and the gorillas in the thickness of the forest knew exactly where she was and could see us, though we couldn't see them. And we sat down in a clearing and had something to eat, specifically so that the gorillas could see that we were friends with Diane. And then we went back to camp. And it was a long day. It's high, it's wet, it's cold. And Diane was at her wit's end, really, and at certainly the end of her strength. And for the days that followed, we went off with Ian Redmond. And it was then that I had an extraordinary encounter, which I suppose, certainly of any film I've ever taken, has been shown many, many more times than anything else, in which I crawled towards gorillas and was prepared to say something to camera. And I felt a hand on top of my head, and I turned around, and there was this huge female gorilla. And she twisted my head round, And then she took her forefinger, huge, great forefinger, and opened my mouth and poked into my teeth. And I was... I suppose I was in bliss, really. I mean, it was certainly one of the most extraordinary experiences of my life. That you had suddenly be aware that a totally wild animal had accepted you. And then I felt a weight on my feet, and I looked down, and two of this female's young gorillas had come out of the bush and were sitting on my feet and undoing my shoelaces. And I simply lay there. I honestly don't know how long it was, but it seemed the time had just hung in the air. And eventually they got fed up and shambled off into the forest, and she got up and went away. And that was that. And later on, we did all the stuff with the thumb and forefinger and all that. But Diane was getting weaker and weaker and weaker. And I went to say goodbye after we'd been up there for a week or whatever it was. And she was very, very ill. And she made me promise that I would do something about gorillas, that I would do what I could to raise support. So when I came back, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I was going to get in touch with this society, with John Burton, who was then the secretary of the society. And I rang up John and said, what can we do? And he immediately, as the society does operate, he immediately put things into action. And the society raised a very great deal of money. And there were other societies too, in America and in Europe, and so on. But nonetheless, this society was right at the forefront. And it was John Burton, therefore, and the society that was responsible for the gorilla funds that are now proceeding and are pretty effective.
Indeed, it was that John set up the Mountain Gorilla Project, which actually Ros Aveling, sitting over there, was one of the first members of the team, who's still with FFI today. And it was John's sort of vision around not just protecting the forest by putting a fence around it, but really by habituating the gorillas, by building on tourism revenues to do that. And it's been successful because of that. But part of it is, I mean, I remember when I joined the society and I thought, oh, well, we don't have a huge number of projects. The gorilla one is our main one, so I'll be going out to see the gorillas anytime shortly. But that was in late 1993, and if you remember, the genocide started happening just shortly after that. So we were sitting in Nairobi planning for what was going on, and at that time, 800,000 people were killed by hand in Rwanda. So it's a horrific time, and nobody was thinking about mountain gorillas, except for one person. And that person was actually leading the rebel forces back from Uganda into Rwanda to successfully take back Kigali. And that person was Paul Kagame, who is now president of Rwanda. And he sent us a telegram, and I remember we got this, and we were in Nairobi having a meeting just about this subject. And Jose Calpez, who was then our project leader, came in and said, look, we've got this telegram from somebody called Kagame, which basically says that he recognizes the importance of the mountain gorillas to his country and will do everything that he can to help. And I think, and you'll probably correct me here, that's the first time that an endangered species has been mentioned in dispatches in some way. So it was significant, but what was even more significant was the fact that, true to his word, once he had been successful, taken back Rwanda, one of the first things he did was got a group of us together to fly out to conduct a workshop and put a plan together to take it forward. And I remember there were no flights to Kigali at that time. And so I went out with Annette Lanyao, who was our project officer in Nairobi, and we got in this Russian freighter where you put all your baggage in the middle, rope it down, sit on the seat and put a rope around your waist. And we went in on that with the clinking of glasses from the cabins and the Russians drinking vodka, flying the plane, not us, but flying the plane. And we landed successfully in Kigali, and I expected it all to be shot up. And it wasn't, because there wasn't a lot of munitions used in that war. It was all by hand. So it was terrifying. And what was going on there was still terrifying. But the fact of the matter is the government were committed to conserving that species because they recognized its potential. And as we sit here today, it is the third biggest revenue earner for Rwanda. The gorilla numbers have gone up from 600 as they were then to nearly 900. I think that was the census in 2010. We're doing another census now, and we're hoping that's going to be further up the ladder, and it's all looking good. At the same time, it's taken us 20 years to get this, but it is a monumental piece of work, in so much as now all three governments, that's the Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, and Uganda, all of whom have mountain gorillas, have signed an accord to conserve them into the future. And that was only signed about 3 weeks ago. So that's a really big plus for us.
So, as it happened, quite soon after that, John Burton decided he was going to start his own conservation group. And the job of running the society became vacant, and you, Mark, were appointed. Now, what had you been doing up to then?
I'd been crocodile ranching.
There you are, I see. Crocodile, go on.
In New Guinea.
New Guinea.
So once I'd left university, I went to the careers advisor, and he said, "What do you want to do?" And I told him, and he said, "Well, are you going to get a first?" I said, "I don't think so." And so he said, "Well, we've got some nice jobs here in the ball bearing factory in South Africa, if that's where you'd like to go to Africa." I said, "No, thanks." I went back to my pigeonhole and found that I had 2 offers of jobs, one in Venezuela and one in Papua New Guinea, working on a conservation project, a crocodile project, which I thought was groundbreaking. It turned out to be groundbreaking, and it was conserving wild species of crocodile by ranching them, but at the same time protecting the mature adults from hunting. So that was the concept, and I flew out there, and I was interviewed in London, and the chap at the interview said to me, "Well, I've been everywhere in New Guinea, so got any questions, just tell me, ask me." And I said, "So have you been to Kikori, this place I'm going?" And he said, "No," he said, "that's a place you fly over. You don't go there." He said, "Hasn't anybody told you it's got 24 foot a year of rain, and there's no access to it, so they'll be dropping you in and that'll be it." And he was right. He was right. So and so I found myself in the middle of nowhere, about 26 years old or 25 years old, can't remember now, surrounded by a whole load of people who didn't know, they hadn't really been familiar with a person from abroad for some time. And I was expected to help the locals set up crocodile ranches in their own villages. And during that period, there were 3 things I think which were dangerous. First of all, there was the crocodiles, of course. Then there was the people interaction, could be tricky at times. And the transport, you're flying around in aircraft in all sorts of conditions, and boats in all sorts of weather. But I was chased lots of times, and you got very good at sort of high jump, getting up trees, with 14-foot female crocodiles come surging out the water. And I think we've all seen the films of them doing this, and believe me, they're like torpedoes, and they run really fast. So you have to be fast. But I think the worst experience was going out with my team for the first time, and we were going into villages, and we were having to do a census of their crocodiles in the village, and also looking at health and growth rates, etc., etc. And so each village had a village pond or a set of village ponds, which might, I think this first one was about 25 meters by about 50 meters, quite big ponds. And I always believe in, if I'm asking somebody to do something, I'll always do it myself. So I said, "So guys, what are we doing?" And they said, "Well, we've got to go in and get all the crocodiles. And they're all saltwater crocodiles, so they'll all go to the bottom. Freshies come up to the top and you can noose them. Salties, which are the bigger, more aggressive, all go to the bottom. And I said, well, don't these guys do that? Oh, no, they don't do that. They just catch them at night and put them in there, but they're not going to go in after them. But we're going in after them. Said, oh, yeah. Now, I've been, all my experience in catching animals have been in West Africa, where I did it for a living at one time, and that was actually, all above, you weren't in the water. So if you can imagine the scene, you've got this pond, there's no visibility in. It's got green slime all over the top of it. And what you're doing is you're lowering yourself into the pond to about here. Now, we've got dangly bits, right? We've got that. And they're all there, it's okay. But, so as you're lowering yourself into the pond, you're thinking, okay. So what you actually did was you were armed. You were armed with a rubber band and a copra sack, a coconut sack. And the trick was that you'd walk around and you'd feel for a crocodile under the water. Now, there were lots of them because these were quite densely packed ponds. So, but what you were feeling for was the sort of hard head. And once you got the hard head, you would actually lean into the water and you would lean down into the water and you would get it either side of the head and you bring its jaws just up to the surface so its nose just came out. And once you'd done that, you'd bring your copra sack and you'd float it over the top. And then on your wrist, you'd have your big rubber band. And you'd hold the snout, and all the time you're thinking, please. And you'd bring the rubber band over the top. And then you would call for a noose from one of your erstwhile colleagues on the side. And he would throw you a noose, and you'd put it round, and then you would stand back, and all hell would break loose. And you would hope that the other crocodiles didn't join in. And so that's how we used to do that. We used to do that every day when we were patrolling. And after that, I said to the guys, what, don't you get injured, And they said, no, crocodiles don't bite underwater. No. I said, but you've all got scars. They said, yeah, it happens sometimes.
So you see, your secretary of your society is a practical man who knows what it's about. So what made you apply for this job?
Well, as I said, I worked for the society before in the 70s, when we first started up traffic and the trade centre. And I was just, as I said, struck by the organisation. And I'd watched it sort of, with John's leaving, go into the doldrums a bit. Nothing seemed to be happening. And then I was rang up by a firm of headhunters. And they said, well,
New Guinea, I assume.
But no. I thankfully left those behind. That's another story. But so these headhunters rang me up and they said, would you think about applying for this? And they sort of, I said what the terms and conditions were, and I said no, because they weren't clearly enough. But I was actually quite interested in the society and taking the job, although at that time I was working for the Wildlife Trust, and I was very much enjoying that job. We just merged 3 trusts together, and it was challenging, and it was great fun, and I was enjoying it. So I wasn't looking for a job. So I went through a series of what I would call bizarre interviews, because the headhunters came back and said, all right, we'll offer you what you asked for. So I went through these bizarre interviews and eventually was rejected. Apparently I wasn't a popular choice with the staff. Anyway, the person he might be here tonight actually, I don't know, who was offered the job decided not to take it. And so they came back to me and they said, but we'd like another third interview. But we'd like some more of the staff involved at this time. Well, there's only 5 staff, so it wasn't many. And so I had this second interview. And I think begrudgingly they sort of offered me the job, and people worried about their jobs. And the fact that I was very good friends with John, and there was all that sort of interaction. And so I took the job, and here it was, 1993. In October, I started. in November, we had our 90th birthday, and the Queen was coming, and we didn't have a venue or the money to do anything at that time. We did it. It all came out fine. But we were here in the RGS, in the basement. And I really look at those as sort of my dark years, a couple of years in the basement with a small group of people trying to think about what we were going to do with this organisation to take it forward. And I recruited gradually people, talented people, and we looked at what we needed to do and what was missing from the conservation world. And the two things that we identified was the fact that not enough building capacity was going on around the world. Too many projects were going on short term, and so lasting capacity and sustainability wasn't built in. The other thing was relevance. Conservation was very much a bolt-on extra. It was seen as a bolt-on extra. You know, it was what middle people do from the north, and they go to the south and they look at wildlife. This was what it was all about. And we had to dispel that. So we had to make it relevant at the local level with local communities, relevant at the government level, and relevant at the corporate level. And that's what we sought to do. And was joined then by Martin Hollands and Mike Appleton in the first instance. And they really drove this whole capacity building agenda at that time. And then we were able to move in to Cambridge. And I was very keen to go to Cambridge because I thought there was a good cluster of conservation organisations there. I thought with the university we could build a global first in the world's first science-based conservation hub. And we debated this at our council meetings, and there was a lot of blood on the walls when we decided to leave the RGS and move up to Cambridge, where we are now. And that was a real turning point, because suddenly, you know, for £4 a square foot, we had an office like a football pitch, courtesy of the Forestry Commission, only 4 desks in it. And that was the start. And I remember Abby, who's here tonight, she came to join us at that time. Jenny did as well. And we built up a team, a very talented team. And that's, I think, been the secret of the success of this organisation, is basically being very clear about what it wants to achieve and how to achieve it, and having the right people on board in terms of staff, and also trustees. We've had some tremendous trustees over the years, and no more than we've got today under the chairmanship of Andrew. And so I think those were the two things. I can remember people debating, because part of that strategy was working to local need. Who are we to go around the world saying, you must have this or you must do that? And people said, well, they were forever trying to find a reason for being and saying, well, can't we define that a little bit more, like hotspots or regions? Oh, where are we working? And I remember saying, well, I'd just given a report about what we were doing in South Sudan, DRC, and Congo, and Liberia, and they said, hey, great, why don't we focus on the conflict regions? And you could see all the staff sitting around the table thinking, oh, my God. And I said, well, you know what our insurance bill would be like? And that was the end of it.
So you see, the Society is now involved in something which is another milestone, another breakthrough. Conservation, which started with, as we've just said, big game hunters, is something very much bigger now. It is internationally recognized, and with it comes all kinds of complications. The Society is nothing if it is not science-based. That we're quite sure about. And what were the connections between the Society and not big game hunters, but scientists, zoologists, ecologists? What is the connection is now that Cambridge University has started within its campus a new centre in which conservation bodies like us, together with the RSPB and with other...
BirdLife, Tropical Biological Association,
exactly.
IUCN Traffic, they're all there.
And are coming into contact with the scientists who are working at the university, so that, and other people who have wisdom and experience in the problems of conservation, which are legal problems and financial problems and geographical problems. All that is coming together in Cambridge, and it's due to open in about another year's time. And that will be another great first. And FFI FFS has...
FFI?
Yeah, get it
Got it
right
right first time.
This organisation is right in the centre of that. So now, Mark, what are your other plans as what you're going to do in the coming years?
Well, before we say that, I'd just like to say, and the centre is opening in April, as David has said, and it's going to bear David's name, the David Attenborough Building. So...
Thank you very much. That's very kind. Thank you.
And he has offered to abseil down the side of it.
Well...
I hope they haven't taken him up on that.
No, the thing is, there's this huge new building. It's right in the centre of Cambridge, off Downing Street, if people know, on the part of the university where the zoology department is and the zoology museum is. And I was being shown around all these wonderful new buildings. It's an Arab building which has been modified. And they said, pointing to a thing about as high as this room, if not higher, there's going to be a green wall. And I said, crikey, a green wall? How do you water a thing like that? And they said, oh, we'll have a device with rolls or with ropes or something like that. I said, great, that's the way we ought to be opening it, you see. And they said, you're on. And you see, so I mean, it could be that that's what's going to happen. Could be the last thing I do. However,
but before we go forward, I'd just like to step backwards just 1 minute, if I may, just to the forests and the rainforests. And why I'd like to step back is because, and also the comment I just made about working in conflict zones. And Liberia comes to mind. We've been working in Liberia since about 1992. We worked all the way through that civil conflict and strife, all the way through the Charles Taylor days there, and we had a young guy working for us at the time who was our Africa director. We demoted him to Liberia project officer because he spent all his time in Liberia, very dangerously going backwards and forth, helping to build the capacity of that country. And nobody was interested in Liberia. And we had, I remember, and this is why I remembered it, we had a meeting here to try and raise money for that project. And we didn't have all these people like we've got tonight. It was in the small council building, meeting room, just up there on the right. And Jameson gave a very passionate presentation about the plight of the rainforest, which is, after all, 55% of the Upper Guinean rainforest, full of very threatened and endangered species, very rare species, like the pygmy hippo. And following which, I was the money man. I got up and asked, people to donate. And I threw in a few statistics around about how big the forest was and how much we'd already raised, which was significant, actually, at that time. And just before I came on, the doors opened, and it was an African woman, clearly Liberian, with two rather large, beefy-looking guys by the side of her. And she listened to what I had to say. And this woman turned out to be the president's wife, Agnes Taylor. And she came up to me and she said, Mr. Rose, she said, I was fascinated by what I heard you say about all the money that you have raised for the country to protect its forests and all the money that you're going to raise. And then she paused and she said, but when we've cleared it all, will you pay us to replace it? And that's when I realized the problem that we had. But we did. Charles Taylor went off into jail. The first thing we did when that happened was we deployed a Liberian-American trained lawyer called Anya Vorez, and she went back to Liberia, having been educated in the States, and she rewrote the forestry laws, which were non-existent. And to this day, the reason that rainforest still exists in Liberia is because of that action at the time. It gave some concrete basis on which to put together forestry protection for the future. We're still working there. I was there 3 weeks ago. We've got a marvellous team working out there doing a fantastic job. We've had the Ebola, and that's really, I thought people would be a little bit under the weather was a hangover from that. But they're not. They're as enthusiastic and as skillful as ever. And, you know, Liberia is going from strength to strength from our point of view in terms of forest conservation.
And what about the future?
The future? Well, one of the things that we've embarked upon recently with great support from Lisbeth Rousing and Peter Baldwin was on a marine program. Now, we, as you know, most people here know, principally we've been a terrestrial program most of our life, but then we found ourselves sort of dipping our toes in the water in places like Belize and Nicaragua. And we've decided that we would confirm a marine program and expand it with the help of Lisbeth and Peter. And that was about 3 or 4 years ago. And now we're working in all down the east coast of Africa, working with local communities to manage their own marine resources. That just isn't practical work in the field, but it's also about getting laws changed within the country to allow that to happen, so they have their own rights in those areas. We're doing the same in Aceh, and we started this post-tsunami, that tragic event when everything was wiped out, including the fishing fleet and everything that goes with that. So we've rebuilt the fishing fleet with the help of the World Bank and other multilateral organizations. We've now worked with the local people to manage in their own areas. In both instances, we've seen sizable increases in catch and populations of the species there. So this is sort of great news, really. In addition to that, we've taken some more sort of cross-cutting themes, more generic themes, not just geographical. And one of them is, I think I've got some here, marine plastics. These are known as nurdles. I call them poison pills, because that's exactly what they are. These are the building blocks of every plastic that we have in the home, on the car, and everything else. This is how plastic is transported and stored around the world. The trouble is that if you go to any beach in this country, or anywhere, and put a quadrat down, within an hour, you will start to find nurdles. They're everywhere you can think of. And then they don't just do physical damage to marine life. They're also toxic. They're not toxic in themselves, but what they do is they're attracted to toxins in the sea. So suddenly each one of these little nurdles becomes a poison pill for the animal that it's in. And you can see what the consequences of that will be. So the solution to this is not too tricky, really. It's just to get the industry to start to transport nurdles in sealed containers. When they're transshipped, stop them going down drains, and just basically clean up the whole industry. And that's what we're doing. And we're having some remarkable success with some of the big shippers and some of the big processors. The other thing that we're doing on plastics is, I think most of you who use face scrubs might or might not know that they've changed over the years. The original face scrub used to have sand in it. It now has plastic, or did have plastic. So what we've done, we've created the Good Scrub Guide. And we've designed an app which goes with that, so you can go to your shop and you can buy a good scrub by just looking at the label and putting the barcode on the app, or you can or we can send you the Good Scrub Guide, and you will know what companies are doing good scrubs and those who aren't. And I have to say, so far, all the companies that we've gone to have changed to a much more sustainable basis.
I was shown a piece of film a few months ago now of an albatross coming back after having circled the Antarctic continent to feed its chick. It's been away for weeks, and the chick has been there waiting. And the parent arrives, opens its beak, the chick opens its beak, and what pours from the adult's crop is plastic. Nothing but plastic. Not a fish, anything, just plastic. That is the scale of the disaster which we are facing with plastic. Thank you, Mark. The book is going to come out
Back end of next year,
next year.
Back end.
Back end of next year.
with honourable intent.
It's called.
You'll get a flyer tonight.
Yeah. From what you've heard already, I think you'll find that that book will be absorbing reading. And so join me in congratulating Mark on his tenure of this important material.
David, Mark, thank you very much. I don't think I'll ever look at Mark in quite the same way again after the baby elephant story. We have got a small number of questions. There were lots, but if you're happy just to take a few that people here have posted. We've got a few minutes, so we'll just bounce through them. One of the things that is very much in the news at the moment is, of course, the illegal wildlife trade. And we see it in rhino horn, we see it in ivory, and we know that Asia is one of the great markets for those products. What do you both think FFI can do? What do you think others can do to try and do something about the demand in Asia for ivory and similar products?
Well, I think first thing is that you've got to protect what you've got. So what FFI is doing is we're very much at the forefront and cutting edge of protecting the herds of elephant and rhino where they are. So that's the first thing we're doing, and we're focusing on countries like northern Mozambique, Guinea, which has got a forest population of elephants in it, and also in northern Kenya as well. So they're the three things that we're doing. I think in the bigger demand side of things, I think that we've got to get world leaders to put pressure on particularly the Chinese because their impact on coming through Africa more and more in terms of building infrastructure projects has led to an increase in demand or an increase in ability to get ivory out of Africa and Asia into the markets in China. And I think it's a good opportunity with the Chinese Premier here this week, and I know that, David, you've been involved in some work earlier this week with Prince William in order to influence the decision-making around that. And I think that if the conservation organisation and governments and figureheads, President Obama has come out in favour of a ban on ivory. Former President Clinton has. Our own royal family has. There's more head of steam building up on this matter than there's ever been. And I think it's just a question of time before there's a complete ban on legal and illegal ivory going into countries such as China. But I think what the critical thing is for us at the moment is that I think the traders know that too. And so there's going to be more pressure on elephants and rhino in the near future than there has been to date. So we've just got to be vigilant. We've got to gear up for it. We're investing a lot of money in species protection right now in the countries I've mentioned. And also doing a lot of work in places like Vietnam and Myanmar, which are some of the markets for the rhino horn.
Can I add to that? Yesterday, I was in King's College and sharing a platform with Prince William. And the Chinese have a very, very popular program, a chat show, as you might call it. And they sent over their anchor, the man who does it all, and with him a basketball player who's 7'6" tall, I mean, an immense man, who on his retirement has become involved in conservation. And this program has recorded a speech made by Prince William which spoke it as it was. I mean, he said, let us be clear, there is no scientific reason at all to suppose the rhino horn helps in any medical problems of any kind. That killing elephants just for trinkets is catastrophic. And I also made a speech, but the anchor, the Chinese anchor, knew what he was talking about. And he spoke, because we had simultaneous translation, he spoke very powerfully about how important it was. I said, if you Chinese people can prepare the giant panda, which you have, you know the importance of the natural world. You understand why creatures are important and why that we have a responsibility towards the other creatures with which we share the planet. And that is, I'm told, going to be broadcast in China. And let's be, and China has outlawed ivory. No, it has done that, and the government has taken these steps. Taking steps for government is one thing, putting it into practice is another. But nonetheless, I think world opinion is shifting.
That's a hopeful message. Thank you. Now, we've had a bit of a role reversal here this evening, and we've seen you in the role of interviewer. And I've got a question here. If you had your time over again, what would you do differently?
Well, I wouldn't be an interviewer, I'll tell you. I have no idea. Mind you, that I had no idea what I was going to do anyway. I mean, I took a degree in zoology, not because I thought I was when I was a boy, there was no television. I couldn't have that as an ambition. And I didn't know anything about it. And so I took a degree in zoology because I was interested in the natural world, as Mark did, and as I'm sure many of us here did. And I had no idea how I would use it at all. And I then had to go into the Navy because it was a conscription. And I came out of the Navy, and I didn't feel like going back on a government grant. I don't know why, but I didn't. And I moved into television. I had a spell in educational broadcasting, in educational publishing, which was awful, absolutely indescribably boring. Knocking out commas and putting full stops in and things like that, which is what you did in the 40s in publishing. I mean, it was Gutenberg, and that's gone, thank heavens, for anybody else who might be employed in it. But anyway, I went to and joined television when it was in the early days, and it's very good to be in an organisation that's growing fast. And I did all kinds of programs, but eventually managed to turn it into doing what I enjoyed doing, which was looking at filming animals. And I had a moment of rush of blood to the head and became an administrator for 7 years, which is also pretty terrible. But I'm now back doing what I'm enjoying doing, so I'm having a good time.
Wonderful. Thank you. Now, Mark, your career was fairly unusual, and I think we'd also all go away thinking about what it must be like to get into a pond with. And a question for both of you, actually, is what advice would you give to anyone hoping to go into a career in conservation and research biology in the next few years? Presumably not crocodile ranching as your first step.
It's a good future in it, actually. It's been very successful, very successful. I would actually say, first of all, decide whether you're going into research biology or conservation. That would be the first thing. And then make sure that you network in your third year at university or even before, in order that you get to know different people. And all other things aside, I'm assuming somebody's going to get a reasonable degree and have reasonable motivation, et cetera, and not have two heads, then the networking thing will actually be the most important thing that you can do.
I suppose that's so. The other thing to say, I suppose, is that don't be too precise in what you think your ambitions are. if you're concerned with the natural world's a large and varied place with many, many facets to it, many facets which you perhaps won't know and can't know, and perhaps nobody knows at this moment. But get a good degree. Keep your mind open and learn about things. And then when the opportunity comes, take it. That's hopelessly utopian, I suppose, as a kind of advice. But nonetheless, that's the way it is. And I couldn't possibly have had an ambition to do what I'm going to do because it didn't exist. And people out there who are taking degrees now can't possibly know what opportunities they will have in another 5 years' time. It'll not be well paid, that's for sure. But if that's what you want to do, that's what you want to do.
Thank you. Finally, there's a great deal of pressure. You talked earlier on about the pressure of people in the world on natural spaces. And many people see an opposition between conservation and human development. And in protected areas all over the world, there's pressure for development. How do you think we should deal with that? How should FFI deal with that? How should society deal with the challenge of a natural world that's increasingly threatened, but a human population that quite rightly expects and deserves to have a better life?
Well, the statistics are that at the moment, I think we've got 6 billion people in the world. The projections are by 2050, we'll have 9 billion people in the world. It's also predicted that the carrying capacity for the planet is 10 billion, so we're very, very close by 2050 to being up to that. But the worst thing about it all is the fact that most of that increase is going to be in impoverished areas such as Africa. I mean, there's 27 countries in Africa which are going to be affected, and the rest are going to be throughout Asia. So it's going to be, the population boom is actually going to be concentrated on 2 or 3 continents, in areas which are most vulnerable. So what we've got to do now is try and identify those areas which are going to, and work to set up mitigation programs to deal with that. It's not. I don't say that you can stop the population growing. That's outside the remit of FFI. But we can look in a great deal of detail at those areas where we know there is going to be population increase. Countries like Rwanda, for example, and we can start to work with the authorities there to try and mitigate and try and plan accordingly for the wildlife.
I would add one thing to that. The increase in the human population is terrifying. We know how it's going to grow. And we know that the Earth is finite. So anybody who thinks you can have infinite growth in a finite environment is either an economist or mad. There is one slender fragment of hope. Wherever a society has enabled women to have the control over their bodies, to have a political vote, to be literate, to have access to medicines, the birth rate falls. And that applies everywhere. There's Kerala in India, which is thought to have problems with population, as it does. Kerala is in that situation, for example. That can only be a reason for us to help societies that don't have those things, to get those things. And that's one powerful reason why any nation should take an international view about what it does in the world.
thank you for the most stimulating hour and a bit. We've been entertained. We will take away images we won't forget. We've been educated. We've seen you in new roles. Started something new here. I'm enormously grateful. I know everybody here has been completely rapt by what we've heard. The two of you, between you, the experience that you've had and the knowledge and the wisdom that you've got, I think is inspiring. It's awe-inspiring. And I hope that people take away from this, as I know they do when they see the work that you do, an image of what is possible and a vision of what FFI has achieved and can achieve. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's been fantastic.
Thank you.